take action on institutional racism. Really want to apologise for the noise in the background. I'm still in Parliament, but I'm going to attempt to chair this meeting as best I can before my next vote. This event is part of Arise, a festival of Labour's left ideas, and supported by the Labour Assembly Against Austerity and our media partner, Labour Outlook. It's the first in a number of in-conversation events hosted by Arise in a format that is hoped to facilitate an in-depth discussion and socialist political education. And all around the world, governments, including our own, are still failing to protect health and people in this pandemic. And our government is one of those that has most failed here and also most resorted to scapegoating to distract from their disastrous handling of the pandemic, including through attacks on Muslims, the BlackLivesMatter movement, migrants, and refugees. This discussion then is particularly important, and it's particularly important that the left sees itself as not only in solidarity with the global Black Lives Matter uprising, but also prioritises fighting racism, backing Black self-organisation and internationalism. Indeed, Arise is also a festival of internationalism and unity, and this discussion couldn't be more timely as we face Trump and Trumpism in the midst of the current pandemic on a global scale, but also the upcoming US election and the prospect of an end to Trump. Due to the amazing level of interest, as well as this Zoom webinar, we are streaming live, direct from the Arise YouTube page and over a dozen Facebook pages as the event goes on. Please post questions in the comments below the stream on here and in the Q&A session on Zoom, and we'll put some on our panel. Please also make sure that you donate to the link provided so Arise can continue hosting these important events. Our speakers for this vital discussion on how we can fight racism for equality and liberation today will both introduce their views for 10 minutes each, and then we'll move on to your questions. So I'm going to start with Diane Abbott MP, who, as everybody will know, was the first Black woman elected to Parliament and the Labour Member of Parliament for Hackney and former Shadow Home Secretary. Diane.
Thank you, Belle. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Very good. I wanted to begin this very important debate by making the point that using migrants, the ruling class using migrants to play divide and rule with working people goes back centuries. And it's important, I think, to know it's an old narrative, and basically people play the same tunes. In 1870, Karl Marx, who some of you will have heard of, wrote to his followers in London about the working class and anti-Irish racism, because anti-Irish racism was a huge thing in Britain at that time. And that division between the Irish working class and the English working class lasted almost to the current day in cities like Glasgow, Liverpool, Lancashire. But what Marx wrote all those years ago in 1870 was this. He said, every industrial and commercial centre in England now possesses a working class divided into two hostile camps, English proletarians and Irish proletarians. He explains a bit about it, but he finishes these lines by saying this. This antagonism is artificially kept alive and intensified by the press, the pulpit, and the comic papers. I think he meant the Sun at that time. In short, by all the means at the disposal of the ruling classes. This antagonism is the secret of the impotence of the English working class, despite its organisation. It is the secret by which the capitalist class maintains its power, and the latter is quite aware of this. And that was true when Marx was talking about antagonism between English working people and Irish working people, and it's true today when we're talking about antagonism between English working people, people of colour who are migrants, and of course Eastern European migrants. And just as it was true in 1870, that narrative that you'll hear, actually, even from people in the labour movement who should know better. They want to say that Eastern European migrants are undercutting people's wages. It was wrong in 1870, and it's wrong now. And I think it's really important that people in the labour movement don't fall prey to this delusion. It's not migrants that undercut anybody's wages, it's predatory employers, it's globalisation, and it's the undermining of trade unions' rights and freedoms that we saw under Thatcher was not reversed under a new Labour government and continues to this day. So we're talking about something which goes back centuries. We're talking about something where it's the same old tunes going back centuries. And we're talking about something which actually, despite the fact that you'll find people in the trade union movement sometimes saying it, really only benefits bosses and managers and the employing class. The other thing to say about anti-immigration sentiment is not just that it weakens working class people as a whole, but it distorts our campaigning. We're still engaging with a hugely difficult debate around Brexit. Now, there are some perfectly respectable reasons to be anti-Brexit. Tony Benn, who I was a huge fan of, he was also very sceptical about the EU. And I don't know if he'd been voting last year, or 2000, the year before, wasn't it? But I don't know if he'd been voting at the time of the referendum if he wouldn't have voted to leave the EU. That's how strongly he felt about it. But Tony Benn was not a Little Englander. Tony Benn did not want to leave the EU because he thought EU migrants were undercutting wages and jobs. Tony Benn was sceptical about the EU because of issues of democracy and accountability. Sadly, in the EU referendum, many of the arguments being peddled by UKIP and the right wing of the Conservative Party were all about migration. You had Tory MPs claiming, quite wrongly, that Turkey was going to join the EU and would be overrun, to put it in quotes, by Turkish migrants. And UKIP ruthlessly played the immigration card in whipping up feeling against the EU. All of you will remember that poster of Nigel Farage in front of, it was a poster and he stood in front of it and there was a big image of migrants and it was all playing to people's fears. And it meant that when we as a party had to try and resolve the Brexit issue, again, there were people who should have known better in our party saying that the reason that we had to support Brexit was because of freedom of movement, and freedom of movement was a bad thing because it was undercutting wages and undercutting workers. And I repeat, that argument was as wrong during the European referendum campaign as it was wrong in 1870 when Marx tried to counter it. But it is still, anti-immigrant feeling is still out there and still, as Karl Marx said, whipped up by the press and the comic papers. You often hear that we're not allowed to talk about immigration. In fact, for as long as I can remember, the papers love talking about immigration. If it's not one ethnic group, that's a scarce story, Romanian legacy and headscarves, it's another ethnic group. In fact, the newspapers and the comic papers, they love to talk about immigration. The idea that we're not supposed to talk about it is quite wrong. It's a kind of big lie. What we have to do in fighting racism and fighting anti-immigrant feeling is to put the facts before people. And of course, one of the facts is that immigrants aren't responsible for undermining wages. But the other fact is immigrants play a very important role in our economy. And one thing about the COVID tragedy, and it was a tragedy, but it did make clear to a lot of people who perhaps haven't thought about it enough, how much our health service and our social care service is dependent on migrants. There was a period when every day you had a picture on the front of a newspaper of a health service or a care worker who had died, and they were nearly all migrants. Of the first 23 NH doctors that died during the COVID pandemic, 22 were migrant doctors. So I think we have to keep people thinking about this. We're not talking, when we talk about migrants, about people who are coming here to draw benefit, undercut wages, and who are a burden on the society. We're talking about people who are here building our society, particularly the public sector. And so let me finally say this. I've always felt strongly about the issue of immigration. It was the very first speech I made, my maiden speech in Parliament was about immigration. And tragically, I had to raise many of the same issues that I raised today. But you know, one of the problems with the debate on immigration is partly it's there's so few facts and so much sort of scare stories and so much peddling half-truths. But also one of the things about it is that the debate tends to dehumanize migrants. That's why some aspects of the hostile environment, most of it obviously, was put through under Theresa May. And as many of you will know, I and Jeremy Corbyn and Donald McDonnell all voted against those bits of Tory immigration legislation. But some of the hostile environment, you know, was started under the Labour government. It was Alan Johnson as a Labour health secretary who changed the rules in health service because there was a huge kind of row in the papers about so-called health tourism. So it was a Labour health secretary who changed the rules to say you had to prove your British nationality before you could be treated in hospital. So the debate about migration is a very long-standing debate. The attempt to make conditions here in this country so difficult and painful for migrants, the hostile environment, actually predates even Theresa May. And as we go into what will be a very difficult period economically because of the consequence of COVID, we have to stand up and fight on the issue, put the facts out on the issue, and particularly make sure that the labour movement as a whole is united in defending immigrants. Dividing working people never comes to good. Dividing working people is always wrong. We must unite and we must fight for justice for migrants. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Diane, for setting that scene for us. We're going to move straight on to our next speaker, Maya Goodfellow, campaigner and writer for publications like The Statesman and The Guardian, and the author of Immigrants Became Scapegoats. Maya.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for having me, and it's such an honour to be here with two of the country's best MPs in Diane and Belle, who've been doing so much work, who've really been at the forefront of a lot of anti-racist campaigning, but also always there speaking up in terms of thinking about migrant rights when a lot of other politicians are more or less silent. So I am going to talk a bit about this sort of relationship between immigration enforcement and racism. And I want to actually talk a bit about the most recent things that we've heard about government over the past few days in terms of thinking about asylum, but maybe also broadly think about their sort of anti-asylum politics and how that fits in with some of the history that Diane was talking about. And then I'm just going to, at the end, try and very briefly talk about some of the work that I've been doing over the past few months, which is really looking at the ongoing impact of immigration enforcement during the pandemic. And I think that this is really important because migrant rights are one of the things that are first to be trampled over and last to be talked about when we're thinking about things like a global healthcare crisis. And so I just really wanted to very briefly talk a bit about what's been happening over the past 24 hours. And I'm sure you've all sort of seen and heard this news that Priti Patel had asked government officials to look at the asylum policies that had been successful in other countries. And this was specifically looking at asking the Foreign Office, or the Foreign Office carried out assessments about sending people to the Ascension Islands. So this would be a process whereby people would be transferred to these islands, which are thousands of miles away, and kept on these islands, likely in squalid conditions, if we know anything about what's happened in Australia, so that they can't get to the UK. And so it's particularly interesting to think about the fact that the way this was framed is Priti Patel talking about successful asylum policies, and success here really denotes cruelty. It denotes making it much more difficult for people to even get to the UK. And it's just been reported in The Guardian in the past half an hour or so that actually it transpires that government more broadly, this isn't just coming from Priti Patel, but Downing Street too, have been asking government and civil servants to look into a number of other different places to send people where they would be essentially kept in detention centres and wouldn't be able to make it to the UK and have their claims processed there. And I think there's two things. The reason why I'm talking about this is not only are these plans incredibly inhumane, but I think there's two things that it really tells us about where the government is at and where the public debate is at around this. And one of the things is that it tells us what the Tories meant when they were talking about the Australian-style points-based system that they talked about so much during the general election. It's quite it's not surprising, but it's distressing, I think, and really disappointing that this was a phrase that was used really regularly by the Conservatives during that general election campaign in December, but it was barely probed at all during the election. And I actually did some media around this just in relation to the Conservatives' election plans more generally during the election campaign. And I remember saying to a producer, oh, we should also talk about this Australian-style points-based system they keep talking about, because no one's talking about it, and this isn't what it is. It isn't going to be like Australia's system, and even if it was, we should talk about that. And there was sort of silence on the other end of the line, because there was just no interest in exactly what these policies, what this actually meant, what this phrase would mean. And I think that it's telling, because the two of the things that this Australian-style points-based system, this line, that was used actually by New Labour as well, and has been used by UKIP and has been used by the Conservatives, is it really conjures up an image of toughness, but it also conjures up images of whiteness. And this is something that is sort of underlying the debate, is the subtext of a lot of this sort of language. And one of the ways that the Australian-style points-based system phrase conjures up this idea of toughness, although it is about the immigration system, actually what a lot of people know about Australia's asylum system is that they keep people in these offshore detention centres where people are in absolutely appalling conditions. There are so many reports about how horrendous these centres are. And so I think actually when the government is talking about Australia, they know in the background is this idea that Australia is sort of no nonsense. It won't take in too many people, and it will be very tough. And so I actually think the government are trying to sort of signal that that's the path that they want to go down. But the other thing is, as Diane said, is a lot of this isn't new. And so with this very proposal to try to keep people in offshore detention centres, this is something that New Labour explored as well. And I think it's very important. One thing is very important to know this history of New Labour that Diane sort of alluded to, is because one of the things that is often said about the New Labour years is that anti-immigration sentiment grew under New Labour as a natural reaction to too much immigration. right? That's the line, is that New Labour let too many people in, and that's why you see this rise of UKIP, and that's why you see this sort of uptick in really, really xenophobic language and in thinking. And this totally ignores how New Labour were aggressively anti-asylum almost immediately, both in their rhetoric and in their policy. And really it was only MPs like Diane who voted against a lot of that New Labour legislation that was incredibly regressive. So you might have heard about the fact that people who are waiting on their asylum claims can't work, and they receive a really small amount of money from the state. And it was New Labour that introduced that. And so I think we should really, really understand how a lot of the things that we're seeing now are reminiscent of the New Labour years. That doesn't mean that we ignore the very distinct ways the Conservatives can make things much worse. And I think, unfortunately, most likely will make things much worse, both in terms of their really inflammatory rhetoric, but also their policies. So I'm not saying these are the same thing, but I do think we need to recognise that we've heard a lot of similar to this before, and we've seen some of these really, really anti-asylum takes before. And I think this should really show us that we need to understand history. So the history that Diane spoke about, that history of the anti-Jewish sentiment, that history of these arguments often being directed at different groups, but repeated. And that's really important, because what it will allow us to do if we understand that history, which is something that I have written about in my book, is that it shows that a lot of immigration legislation that was introduced in the 60s and 70s, 80s, it was specifically about making it more difficult for people coming from the colonies and former colonies who were not white, so people of color, to come to this country. That was the aim of a lot of the legislation. And it shows us, that history shows us, how racism and immigration, anti-immigration sentiment are bound together. And as I've sort of said, things have shifted in a lot of ways, in ways that can be quite difficult to pin down. But what we need to understand is that racism is still very much central to the anti-immigration debate. It's still key to how immigration is understood and how it's legislated for, albeit in slightly shifting in different ways from decades before. And a lot of policy is about keeping out this sort of racialized outsider, or about making the terms upon which people enter the country worse. And so the reason why I was wanted this phrase about the Australian-style points-based system to be probed more during the general election campaign is we had a Conservative Party that said that they would learn the lessons from Windrush, but actually what the Australian-style points-based system is really about is it's about both, which it isn't. The government aren't going to introduce a system that is directly the same as Australia's, but what that phrase conjures and what they want to do in terms of policy is they want to make it impossible for some people to get here, whether that be people who are trying to seek asylum, or whether that be people who want to move to the UK for all kinds of different reasons. There are certain groups of people who are poorer, people who are not white, that they want to make it much more difficult for people to get here. But what they also want to do is they want to make worse the terms upon which people come into the country. So we've seen this in the form of very short-term visas, so people can come for a year or two and then they have very few rights to stay, or it's very difficult to stay. Or you see it in the ways that routes to citizenship are either made impossible, totally inaccessible, or incredibly long, having to be in the country for a very long time. And so we know that this system is racialized and it's classed, and it is essentially constructed on the basis that some people are a problem who shouldn't be allowed to come into the country, and some people can come into the country as long as they can be exploited by the bosses and the sort of the system that Diane talked about, but they will then be removed at the will of government. And I think, just to end, we can see the connection between racism and anti-immigration sentiment in all kinds of ways. We can see it by the fact that people who've been killed by immigration enforcement, people like Joy Gardner or Jimmy Mubenga, but we can also see it in the images that are shown to us of people when they're crossing the channel. So this sort of most recent moral panic around people making these crossings totally ignores the fact that there are very few safe routes for people to be able to get to the UK, which at the moment you have to be in the UK for most people to be able to claim asylum. But what we've had in this moral panic is this summer of news stories and reporting of images of Black and brown people trying to get to the UK. And we know what the subtext of those kinds of images are. We know that that's incredibly dehumanizing. And we've seen journalists go out in boats and travel alongside boats of people trying to get here, almost in this sort of voyeuristic way, as if their lives just cease to matter at all. And the final thing that I wanted to mention that I think is really important to note when we're in the middle of this pandemic is not only how people claiming asylum are being treated as they try to get to this country, but how people are being treated when they are here. And this is something that I know Belle and Diane have talked about and sort of pushed back on a lot, which is so incredibly important, is that the hostile environment is still essentially in operation in all kinds of ways during the pandemic. And so although the government has paused different things, they haven't suspended the hostile environment in its entirety. And so what that means is that a lot of people that I've spoken to are still incredibly scared to access healthcare, and many people are entirely without financial support, and the routes to getting financial support are either non-existent or they're incredibly, incredibly difficult. And I just think we should think about what it must be like to be undocumented in the middle of the pandemic. You are living in a country that has created hostility for years, that has injected fear into public services, has told people that they are not able to access very basic things like healthcare, like housing, like work, and you've essentially been told to be scared of interacting with these public services. And that, although, as I've said, certain things have been suspended and shifted, and the entire system hasn't been. So all of the policies that make up the hostile environment have not been suspended. And so if you are someone who is undocumented living in the UK now, you may well be too scared to access healthcare at a time when healthcare should be the thing that you should be able to access. And it's worth noting that when Boris Johnson was taken to intensive care, there was a sort of outpouring from across the political spectrum of people saying his humanity should be centered. It should be thought about the fact that he is a fiance, a father, a son, a brother. And I do think that we should be asking where that humanity is for those people who are consistently demonized, whether they're people who are trying to cross the channel and dismissed as so-called illegal immigrants, or whether it's people who are undocumented for all kinds of different reasons. And it's worth recognizing that when people are talking about so-called illegal immigrants, they're not thinking about young white Australians who've overstayed their visa. This is itself a really racialized category. And I think this shows us why it is that racial justice and migrant justice are impossible to disconnect, and why we should be demanding that the hostile environment isn't just suspended or isn't just paused in particular ways, but is ended altogether, because this has to be about every single person, regardless of their status, should matter. And if the pandemic hasn't shown that to people, then that is something that I think must be at the forefront of campaigning for change and campaigning for a better world. I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maya. Thank you. So we are going to get the conversation started. Just so that everybody knows, we have over 450 people watching already across all our different platforms, including from London, Mid Wales, Norfolk, Derby, Liverpool, Leeds, Guildford, South Wales, West Sussex, Hull, Swindon, Chippenham, Stockport, Wiltshire, Glasgow, Bradford, Reading, Canterbury, and Somerset. So everybody is in the house. So the first question I want to put to both of you is that actually just touching on the international element and what we're seeing in the US in particular. So the international links between the far right in the US and the rest of the world, including Britain, are well documented, with the alt and far right growing more powerful, with the US president that's refused to condemn white supremacists and militia groups and told the Proud Boys to stand back and stand by, and a UK Conservative Party that's taken its lead from the US Republicans' tactics. How do we go about breaking these links? Diane, how do we go about fixing this?
Oh, Diane, you're on mute.
I think we have to give support to progressive movements in the United States, because the links between the right in America and the right here, whether it's Nigel Farage being best friends with Donald Trump, whether it's his top supporter Steve Bannon giving all sorts of practical support to far-right movements in Europe, we have to link together in the same way, because it's the same message for the same reason. Trump, likes to default to being negative and hostile about migrants because he's trying to appeal to a type of voter in what in America they call the Rust Belt. It's really post-industrial areas, such as we know that we used to have steel, used to have coal mining. He's trying to appeal to Rust Belt voters who traditionally voted Democrat and say, look, I, Donald Trump, are going to save you from those horrible migrants. And that is all of a piece with his line on coronavirus, which he calls the Chinese virus, and is stirring up hatred against the Chinese. Thank you, Belle.
Thank you, Diane. Maya, how do you think we break those links?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and I agree with what Diane said, and I think that part of it is about making those connections ourselves, so making those international connections which exist in all kinds of ways already, but continuing to strengthen those so that there is sort of a cohesive resistance to what these policies look like, because it is in the US, in the UK, but we also have it in other countries like India, Brazil. Like there are resistance movements all around the world against these forms of incredibly right-wing politics. And I think we should also bring in, like, if you look at what's happening in India, it is absolutely horrendous, and there are people resisting that, and I think that's really important. And giving our support and forming connections with grassroots groups, as well as giving resources, is a really key thing to do. I also think the other thing, I guess, is it's not just one thing or another. I think it has to sort of be multifaceted. And one of the things is pushing the bigger parties on their messaging. So whether that is Biden in the US, I've seen a lot of sort of commentary online today saying, oh, don't even bother voting. It's not worth it because Biden's just he's not radical in any way. But I think that what a lot of is being said from progressives in America, including people like AOC, and Bernie Sanders, is you sort of have to have someone who you can pressure in power to get those shifts. And so it's not about giving up. And I think here in the UK, seeing the Shadow Home Secretary's response to these plans that I mentioned that came out from the Foreign Office that looked into about offshore detention centres, the response, it was a tweet, so it's sort of limited in what we can draw from it, but it wasn't, I think that can be pushed because the response was sort of like, this is inhumane, but also it's too expensive and it's not logistically possible. And I just think that's a sort of pathetic reply to what is an absolutely horrendous proposal. So I think actually it is about pushing those people to supporting the people in the parties, who are here with us and who are doing that good work, supporting them to also make those pushes. I don't think we give up on that avenue altogether.
Thanks, Maya. So next question we've had in, Black and Asian and ethnic minority people have already been bearing the brunt of COVID and the deep recession we are currently falling into. What are the 3 most important steps we should all be doing to advance the fight against institutional and structural racism? Diane.
Well, we have to fight it where we are. We have to fight it tactfully sometimes, but we have to fight it in our institutions. Whether our institution is the Labour Party, whether our institution is our trade union, or whether it's an employer that you're working with. And you have to be prepared to support other people that are fighting it. Because when I talk about the Labour Party and trade union, sometimes you get people on the left who say, I can't possibly be racist because I'm a left winger. And I went on an anti-Nazi League march, you know, however many years ago. And it's really important to be prepared to challenge people. We also have to look at some of these practical issues. I think we're going to go into a really difficult economic time, and Black and minority ethnic people will be the worst hit. And whether we're Black and ethnic minority or not, we have to stand up and say this, because it's all too easy to talk about economics in a colourblind way. And again, some people who think they're progressives will tell you, I don't see colour. Well, really? Really, you don't see colour? Well, everybody else does. And if you're going to be effective in fighting for social justice, actually, you have to see colour. And of course, we do, in the long run, we do have to work to get rid of Boris Johnson and his government. But the short-term thing, as I say, is to work within wherever we find ourselves to challenge for racial justice and to give support to people who are also challenging for racial justice, and to make sure that the Labour Party or trade union and so on is promoting the right policies which will help achieve racial justice. Thank you, Beth.
Thanks, Diane. Maya.
Yeah, I think that this is one of the things that I sort of hope does become clear with the pandemic and everything that's happened, is that the way that our media sort of talks about racism or treats racism is exclusively or narrowly only about when someone does or says something that is explicitly racist. So you'll see like reams of debate about whether something Nigel Farage said, is it racist or not? And then you'll have sort of two talking heads, one saying yes and one saying no. I mean, I've been one of those talking heads sometimes, so it's not that I dislike those that I think people shouldn't be doing that necessarily, but I think that that's a really narrow way of understanding it. And what the pandemic, if anything, should have shown us, and who's been impacted and how, is that racism is about far more than only that. And whilst those forms of explicit racism really matter, it is, as Diane says, how it's sort of knitted into our institutions in the way that the jobs that people are in, the housing that people are living in, what people are paid, and how it functions on this really, really insidious level. And I think I've kept coming back during this this really awful time to the definition of racism from the academic Ruth Wilson Gilmore, and she talks about racism as vulnerability to premature death. And that is exactly what we've seen during this pandemic. And so as well as everything Diane said, or I suppose this sits alongside or is part of exactly what she said, is I think that I totally agree that in your campaigning and in your work within whatever sort of political organization or grassroots group you're involved in, don't treat racism as something that is just peripheral. It's a second thought. It's on after everything else. It should be central to absolutely, anti-racist work should be central to absolutely everything you're thinking and talking about, including the economy. And I think also get involved with those local struggles or support further those local struggles where people are asking for things like better housing or asking to not be evicted from their decent housing, to have their council estate knocked down and where big flats are being built. Be part of those struggles, because those struggles are part of this. They are part of ensuring that people have decent standards of living. And I think seeing it in that way is really, really essential, because so much of the media discourse wants to suggest that it's not. And I actually heard someone talk about when Boris Johnson announced this, announced the sort of anti-obesity plans. And I heard someone on the radio saying, oh, well, you can change someone's weight, but you can't change someone's ethnicity. As if it was this sort of racial essentialism, as if it's not the structural factors that are causing, that are the reason that certain groups of the minoritized population are being exposed to COVID. It's not because, we all know this, it's not because of what their race is, it's because of the housing, it's because of the discrimination in housing and jobs. And so I think seeing it in that way and really bringing that to a lot of your discussions and bringing that when you're doing your campaigning on the doorstep as well is really important. And as Diane said, pushing political parties, and I think getting out the wrong people of power and pushing other political parties to be better on this and to have better policies that explicitly, as the Labour Party did at the last general election, explicitly knits this into policy is really, really key going forward.
And thank you, Maya. So we're having lots and lots of questions in from the Zoom. So I'm going to try and combine two of them so that we're getting them in. We've got one from Manira and similar from others as well, asking what positive examples can we give of the left and the Labour movement here doing and saying things that have actually advanced equality, and then what more can we do to make sure the Labour Party is speaking up for working people, as Diana said, and actively mobilising people against racism and speaking up against it. So Diane, positive examples and what more can we do?
At its worst moment, the Labour Party is still a better supporter of Black and minority ethnic people than any other party. And I say that as somebody who is quite clear-eyed about the racism you find in the Labour Party. I mean, The Guardian had a piece, I think, yesterday, which talked about the opposition I have. And, I first became a candidate. I remember I was elected for Hackney North, and the regional director said to me a few weeks later, and he didn't say it in an unpleasant way, really, but he said, we had no idea you would win. If we thought you were going to win, we would have done something. So I'm not somebody that's naive about that sort of thing, but come on, you look at the Tory history, going back to the Daily Mail, having a hurrah for black shirts front page. I mean, I don't think there's any question about the history of the party compared to the history of the Conservatives. Now, the Labour Party could do a lot better. And what practical examples can I give you of things the Labour Party has done? Well, it is the Labour Party which has invested in the public sector in a way which has been to the benefit of working people, and that includes a lot of Black working people, actually. It could have done more to tackle institutional racism and so on, but Labour is a party that is committed to and did spend money on the public sector and on education and on housing and on transport, and that did help people of colour, even if there were other issues about institutional racism. And it's Labour Party people and people on the left, people in other political groupings who have taken to the streets decade in, decade out to protest racism. So I have no problem in saying that the left is potentially a better ally on racial justice than anybody on the right of politics. And Boris, even Mr. I'm so jolly, ha ha Boris, has been ruthless in his way as his friend Donald Trump, and exploiting racism for his own ends. So yeah, the Labour Party could do more, but when you look at its investment in sectors which people of colour depend on, if you look at the fact that all major pieces of race relations legislation have been put through by Labour government, you can't take away the Labour Party's record from it, although there's a lot more to be done.
Thank you very much, Diane. Maya, positive examples and what more could we be doing?
Oh yeah, I feel like I'm the person that everyone thinks always is like criticising the Labour Party's history on this, but it's important. So I mean, I think the Labour Party and the Labour movement is not one thing, right? It's made up of loads of different people who've campaigned for lots of different things. And so one, we know that the Labour Party is the only party that's ever introduced race relations legislation in this country. And although we might want to talk about the limitations of that, it really does matter. Like, it matters that exists, and it matters it does matter that we have that here in the UK. And I wouldn't want to live in the alternative world in which we didn't have that. And so yes, there are severe limitations with it, but it does matter that was off the back of campaigning. Like, a Labour government didn't hand that down, right? There were people involved in the Labour Party and outside of it that campaigned and fought for that. And so whenever we see these sort of wins, we should recognise the struggles that happened. And I mean, not to sort of labour the point, but we're here with Diane, who is one of the MPs who fought and resisted so much of that anti-asylum legislation from the New Labour government. And so yes, the New Labour government was doing that, but there were Labour MPs who were resisting it and who successfully were part of campaigns that stopped them from introducing these voucher schemes that meant people wouldn't be able to get money but would be given vouchers when they were waiting on their asylum claim, which is a horrendous thing to suggest even. But if there hadn't been that resistance, then that would have happened, and that would have been a much more different experience for people who were already in a very hostile system. And I think it's also really important to recognise that the Labour movement historically has major problems with this, but the Labour movement isn't homogenous. It's made up of lots of different, there's lots of different parts to it. And so even now, if we look at the Labour movement, we have some of the bigger unions there's some problems with them, but there's some good stuff they do. But then you also do have these smaller unions like United Voices of the World or IWGB, who are really organising people regardless of whatever their immigration status is, regardless of what language they speak, and they're winning some really big wins. And so at my former university, this was Unison, but at my former university, SOAS, the cleaning staff, who were predominantly migrant, weren't born in the UK, they fought for years to be brought back in-house because they'd been outsourced, and they won that struggle. And so I just think it's worth noting that when the lies that Diane spoke about people undercutting wages, they're everywhere, all over the newspapers, politicians say it all the time, it's not true. But when you actually have people who are migrants winning paying conditions for themselves, that is very rarely on the newspaper front pages as migrants win better paying conditions for British workers, right? And so we can see there what the framing is doing and how. But I do think that there are points in history where we can see these, the left and the Labour movement campaigning on these issues and winning some really important battles.
Thank you, Mai. See, you've got lots of nice things to say. So, I mean, it's really great. We're getting so many questions through. I'm trying to put them all together as much as possible so we can get through. So, a lot of general questions about effective action, about tackling institutional racism in the UK, with a particular focus on police and the justice system. Diane?
Well, I mean, one of the concerning things I've heard recently is Cressida Dick saying more than once that there is no institutional racism in the Metropolitan Police Force. Well, I mean, the figures tell their own story. Black and minority people are disproportionately likely to be stopped and searched, disproportionately likely to be handcuffed, disproportionately likely to be fined under the COVID legislation. And actually, on stop and search, things are no better than the time of the Macpherson inquiry. And the point about institutional racism, which Cressida Dick seems to have forgotten, it's not about whether individual police officers are racist. It's about the systems and the structures. And there's no question that the systems and the structure in the Metropolitan Police and other police forces have outturns which are clearly discriminatory. And I think we have to be prepared to say it. I mean, there's a tendency for people to, particularly now, I think, to say, well, if you say anything about institutional racism in the police force, it means you're anti-police. No, it doesn't mean you're anti-police. The police force will be stronger and more effective if it deals with some of the issues that it has. If it deals with what famously are called the bad apples in the barrel, it will be stronger and it will have better support from the entire community. Belle and I's colleague, David Lammy, actually wrote quite a good report on institutional racism in the criminal justice system, which actually reflects a lot of what we've known about the police service for a long time. There's a danger with the research that's been done on institutional racism in the police force. And there's a danger on David Lammy's report on institutional racism in the criminal justice system that people kind of read about it and then forget about it. And then when it's brought to their attention, they say, oh, really? I didn't know. They should know, because people have been talking about some of these things for years and years and years. So we shouldn't let these issues drop out of the public debate. And we should certainly be pressing my party, the Labour Party, to have a very strong position on these things going into government. I mean, you know, Keir Starmer won the leadership election fair and square, and you have to respect the mandate. But some of us were a little disappointed when he talked about Black Lives Matter as being a moment. It's a movement. And it was a little bit dismissive about defunding the police. No one is saying you take all the money away from the police tomorrow, but you do have to make the police accountable for its funding, and you do have to make commensurate amounts of money available to things like the youth service and mental health services. So yeah, we can't allow these issues to kind of drop out of the public debate because they're serious issues. And just finally, they're kind of tied in with education and in this way. One of the things I campaigned on for years, not with a lot of national publicity, but it was a big thing that I was concerned about. It was when children are suspended from school children are suspended from school. And I always remember there was a man who was called Martin Neri. He'd been head of the prison service, and then he became head of the children's charity. And what Martin Neri said is, on the day you suspend or expel a child from school, you might as well give them a date and time to turn up at prison. And there is a link between Black children, particularly Black boys, and underachievement in school and how the education system is failing them, and the issues we see in our criminal justice system. And we have to keep those issues to the forefront, and we have to continue to campaign on them. Thank you, Chair.
Absolutely. Thank you, Diane. So, Maya, tackling institutional racism with focus on police and the justice system.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think that I agree that Keir Starmer's response to being asked about Black Lives Matter, I thought was pretty appalling, and I thought that one of my issues with it, I mean, aside from what he said, which I just fundamentally disagree with and think it's just not the right thing to say, I also sort of raised an eyebrow because I can't imagine having lived through that summer when the horrendous brutality of the police in America, which we know is not something that doesn't happen here in the UK either, although it's in different ways. The murder of George Floyd, the murder of Breonna Taylor, the murder of so many people in America at the hands of the police. I can't imagine living through that moment and seeing that pain and seeing all of the hurt and the power of the protest, the protest movement, and not having thought about a better response to a question like that. So I raised an eyebrow as to whether that was the intended response. I don't know, obviously, who am I to know one way or another? But if you hadn't thought of a better response, then why? And if that was the planned response, then there's a major problem there, and I hope that changes. And I know that there was a lot of anger, righteous anger, and people pushing for that for him to be better and for the front bench to be better on that. And so that I hope that they have learned some lessons from that. But I also think no one was really expecting Keir Starmer to necessarily say defund the police, but you were expecting him to take it at least a bit seriously, given that there are decades of scholarship about prison abolition and things like defunding the police. The scholar that I mentioned before, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, is an American scholar who has written about prison abolition for years. And so to dismiss this, to dismiss that sort of wealth of scholarship, but also to dismiss all the people who are part of the movement, who've thought about this for a long time, to dismiss them in this sort of way that as if they are ridiculous or it doesn't matter, I think is really worrying. And as I say, I hope that sort of there's a lesson has been learnt there, that it's not just good enough to take the knee for a photo op, you have to also then back it up with words. And the thing that I would say about criminal justice and thinking about racial inequality is I've been reading loads of Stuart Hall recently, loads of Stuart Hall about Thatcherism and sort of how Thatcher use law and order in this really racialized way that we all sort of know about. But what Stuart Hall, he's like really, in the book that I've just been reading, Road to Renewal, he's really critical of the left and the Labour Party. And what he says of the Labour Party is that you need to create an alternative vision of society. You need not only to have policies, but to tell people what society is going to look like, what you're going to do for them, and how you're going to knit in things like gender equality and racial equality into that. And so that's sort of, I don't have the vision. I'm not going to come and claim to have all the answers here. You know, I think we can learn something from the past few years, but I do think that that's maybe where the focus needs to be for the left, is what does that vision of a different society looks like? Because aping the Conservatives or doing a watered down version is not going to get you anywhere, and is not fundamentally, to me, not desirable for the aims of what we're trying to achieve, which is the things that we've talked about, thinking about racial justice and migrant justice. Thanks.
Spot on, Maya. Can't out Tory the Tories. We are running out of time quite soon, but just very, very quickly, because this came in for both of you, and just touching on what you've just said, what would you say is the significance of the global Black Lives Matter movement? Not the moment, the movement. Diane.
I think it's forced a lot of institutions and a great many people to address things which probably most of the people on this call understood. I'm very struck that the polling shows that Black Lives Matter is actually very popular with the ordinary public. In America, it's more popular than either Trump or Joe Biden. I won't say anything about that. And here, it is very popular. People understand about the issue of racial justice. You get some very noisy racists online on Twitter and Facebook and so on. But I think the majority of people understand about the importance of racial justice and want to do better. And I think this is more the case now than years ago when I was a child. People have moved forward. Not as far forward as we would like them to go. Otherwise, they wouldn't be voting for Nigel Farage. But it's a consequence of, you know, a generation, maybe two generations of people going to school alongside people of colour, having family members who are married or relationships with people of colour. I think people understand racial justice is an issue. They want to do better. And we shouldn't think just because tens of thousands of people wrote into ITV about that poor dance troupe doing their dance about Black Lives Matter, that represents the majority opinion. So we have to build on that. We have to build on that. We have to be clear. We have to be analytically clear. We have to be positive, but we have to be hopeful. I always say that if I wasn't hopeful, I wouldn't be on the left of the Labour Party.
Thank you, Diane. Sorry, hopefully that bell stopped. Thank you very much. Maya, the significance of the global Black Lives Matter movement.
I mean, I don't know what I can add to that other than I guess the two things that it sort of shows us is one is so as Diane talked about that polling is actually that I think you can argue that's because of the work done over the past however many years, right? It tells us that opinion is changeable. And so this thing of politicians reading the opinion polls in order to inform their own positions that's not what the opinion poll should be for. The opinion poll should be for telling you where the public are at, so you know where you need to bring them, what the changes that need to happen are. And I think what this shows us is that there has been a massive shift, and that's a positive thing to see that support. But the other thing is that vision of the alternative society that I just talked about before. I think this is exactly what the movement, whilst it's born out of something so horrendous, it does provide that hope. They are coming up with solutions and different ways of living, imagining different horizons for us beyond sort of some of the very narrow ones that some parts of the media and the political class would keep the narrow visions they present us. And I think that for me is one of the most important things about about it, about changing the way that we understand what society can be and what it should be, and who it should work for and who it doesn't work for at the moment. And that, I think, is really powerful. And pretty much all of my hope seems to be invested in this at the moment. And so I think that it's something that we should all continue to support in all the ways that we possibly can, because it is one of the most important things that I think is happened in my political lifetime.
Thank you, Maya. That is almost about all we've have time for. Rather, it's been a great discussion. Thank you both. But before I hand over to Diane and Maya for their final thoughts, I just wanted to thank the hundreds of people that have participated in the call today. We know we have important battles ahead, and also just how important our campaign for people, health and the planet to be put first is, and how central a part of this is saying Black Lives Matter and fighting for equality and liberation for all. We have to keep working together to insist there is no return to business as usual when it comes to our economy and politics, and to not argue that a better world is possible, but win that better world where Black Lives Matter becomes not just a vital rallying cry, but a reality. So please do help and get involved in every single way that you can. You'll see in the chat there's a link to donate to Arise so we can continue hosting these important events. The next Arise event is on Thursday, October 8th at 7 p.m. with Jeremy Corbyn and Mustafa Barghouti in conversation on how we win justice for Palestine. So just before we wrap up, I am going to ask Diane, then Maya, to give us their final thought for the evening. Diane.
Well, I think when it comes to issues of racial justice, we have seen genuine progress over my lifetime. We've seen some awful things, in particular, actually, the debate on migration, but we've seen genuine progress. And I'm a feminist, and feminists always had a saying that power to the sisters is power to the class. And I would say that power to Black people and minority ethnic people is also power to the class. Thank you, Chair.
Absolutely. Thank you, Diane. Maya?
Thank you. Just thank you, Belle, for your really excellent chairing. And it's always a pleasure to see you both and to be part of events like this. I guess the thing that I would probably end on is during the pandemic, one of the things that sort of happened was that there was a recognition that a lot of people who had been dismissed as low skilled were actually key workers. And there was a big push when there was a recognition about what the NHS surcharge did, charge people twice over the NHS just because of their immigration status, something that's been in existence for quite some time. There was a push to ensure that particular workers, in particular healthcare workers, didn't have to pay it. And the government sort of, after a lot of sustained pressure, backed down. But that didn't include everyone. So a lot of people still have to pay the NHS surcharge, as I know Belle and others have campaigned on this. And I suppose the message from that tells us that when we're talking about broad horizons, we have to be demanding justice and equality for everyone. And so absolutely no one should have to pay the NHS surcharge. It simply shouldn't exist. And so in our campaigning and in sort of our understanding of how inequality works, we need to recognize that this is a fight for everyone. It means no one is left behind. Otherwise, someone is going to have to suffer. And so when we're thinking about immigration, we should be thinking about everyone regardless of their immigration status. That includes people who are undocumented too. And so the struggle going forward has to be a struggle for everyone. Thank you. Thanks, Belle.
Thank you, Maya. Unfortunately, they voted to increase the immigration health surcharge last week. If you heard, absolutely disgraceful. Absolutely right, but we will get there one day. Thank you very much. You've both been fantastic, and you've kept to time, which is a first for me. Thank you very much, everybody. Please look into the chat for your further action. As I said, please do donate to Arise and join us for future In Conversations, the next one being on October the 8th with Jeremy Corbyn and Mustafa Barghouti. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a good evening.